Oh, what we see today with the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, a total of 1.5 million visitors coming, websites that reach tens of millions of people a year, and all the publications that we have. Oh, yeah, it's exactly what we envisaged when we first stepped out and to form Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum. Not, we had no idea.
No, to be frank with you.
Not in my wildest dreams is it what we envisioned.
We had no concept. I had no concept this ministry would get to this sort of size. In fact, don't tell anyone, but when we were raising funds for the Creation Museum, Mike Zovath and I talked about the fact we had no idea how we're going to do exhibits.
We started out looking at a piece of property and building a 5,000 square foot Creation Museum, which is just laughable.
All we knew was we had Buddy Davis's dinosaurs, and along comes Patrick Marsh, and God brings Patrick along and turns it into something way beyond we ever imagined.
I remember when we first opened, an evolutionist came to visit, a prominent one. We knew who she was, and she was concerned that the museum was so good looking and full of scientific exhibits that we might fool people into believing in creation.
Now we have our own design team and the Ark and the Creation Museum.
Answers TV and the magazine and curriculum and programs and...
30 years ago, there was no email, no internet to speak of. And so the explosion of things like social media and be able to get out our message in many, many more ways, that's been astounding. And to see so many people come to visit us, the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum from all over the world, that's been a surprise as well.
The verse that I always comes to mind is that God's able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think.
From a human perspective, totally impossible, and certainly impossible with three people like Mark Looy, Mike Zovath, and myself, but God takes these three very unlikely, totally different people, brings them together, and look what happens. It's amazing.
It exceeds my wildest dreams.
I first met Mark Looy in 1980.
Which brings up an interesting fact. I've known Ken then longer than my wife, Renee.
I was invited to do an interview with this guy in El Cajon. Going to that area, I call it was a dingy part of town. It was a dingy studio.
It was probably a dingy radio station. That's the word he uses a lot.
That's an Australian word, dingy. Mike and Mark have come to know what it means.
And there was a drug-infested part of San Diego.
I think it was a drug-infested area or something. I mean, I was a little scared.
So the station was showing its wear, but drug-infested, dingy, I'm going to have to rebut Ken.
I was really worried I was going to be mugged. So we go down there, and here's this guy. He's running this Christian radio station by himself. And I must admit, first time I met him, I sort of smiled a little because I thought, I've met the Wizard of Oz. Because have you ever seen the movie The Wizard of Oz? And Toto pulls the curtain back, and suddenly you see him and he's there going like this and pressing buttons and trying to make all these sounds and things happen. That was Mark Looy. Because in those days they had the reel-to-reel tapes and he's there winding this reel-to-reel, and then while he's interviewing me, he's doing this and he's switching buttons and he's pressing over here and this and winding this reel and that, and I thought, I'm being interviewed by the Wizard of Oz. But it was Mark Looy. That's when I first met Mark.
I thought he was a little eccentric because he and a traveling companion came into the radio studio and they were wearing something like a safari outfit, although with shorts. I thought it was a little eccentric. I don't think I've ever told him that, so don't mention it. Don't mention it to him.
First time I met Mike Zovath, well, that was in 1993.
Well, I had a really close friend who was the business manager at ICR, but then he started telling me about this Australian rock star that was working for ICR now, and he was speaking all over the place.
But I heard from the business manager of ICR, Don Rohr, he's with the Lord now. Listen, I've got this friend of mine. I really want to see him come and work in the ministry. He wants to work in the ministry, and he could help you and Mark with the Back to Genesis programs and so on.
Ken tells a story, I'm sure he told the story, the lieutenant colonel that he expected to come in. Well,
and I'm thinking, wow, I'm going down to meet a retired lieutenant colonel. I was thinking, 6'6" guy, hefty build, he's going to have that big, deep voice, and I'm going to be totally intimidated with this towering, tough soldier guy. And I go down there and I look around the room and I'm thinking, well, where is this guy?
So Patton didn't walk in the door, but I'm a different kind of warrior, and this is what walked in the door. But on the other side of the introduction story, I'm envisioning what Don Ward told me is this stud Australian rock star who is taking the world by storm, and you can see what I was thinking of. And then in walks this guy, and it's Ken Ham. And you could see how disappointed I was. If you thought Ken was disappointed, the comparison was even more stunning. But it even got better later on when you see how Ken evolved or developed. So it was an interesting introduction right off the bat between the two of us.
Oh.
Well, it was like drawing the short straw in this whole thing. Mark got to stay home.
Makes for a good relationship because there's less friction between if you don't see each other that much, your relationship probably gets stronger.
Yeah. There are times in your life you look back at traumatic events.
Ken was crazy to travel with.
And you sort of sigh and you think to yourself, wow, I survived it. I actually survived it. He and I went over to the United Kingdom and Europe.
I decided I could drive a lot better than the volunteer that was driving, even if it was the wrong side of the road.
And Mike loved to drive. I had to be the navigator.
And I really liked, when we'd rent a car, I'd try to rent a manual shift because it was a lot more fun.
And in those days, there's no such thing as GPS. I had this big book of maps, and I got it up in front of me like this.
But the first couple of times, every time I'd turn the turn signal on, the windshield wipers would come on. And I'd get a load of baloney from Ken.
Trying to figure out where to go. And I know in England, we always were getting confused by the slip roads and getting lost. And
first 20 or 30 minutes, we're driving on the wrong side of the road. And I'm trying to get the clutch, figure out the clutch. And if I'd stall the thing, I'd never hear the end of it.
Mike would have fun getting lost. I mean, he thought it was a great joke.
And then the entire trip, it's like you're driving somebody's grandmother around, and he's so worried about the traffic cameras.
And he loved to go around those roundabouts, round and round. He just loved to do that. And
every 5 minutes, there's a traffic camera, there's a traffic camera, there's a policeman, there's a traffic camera.
I remember one time we'd stopped at a restaurant, and we pulled out of the restaurant, and then we turned right to go. I looked up, and all I could see in front was this truck bearing down on us. And you're in such shock, I couldn't even talk. And all I did was I just put my hand over, grabbed the wheel, and like that, to pull him out of the way. I saved our lives. I mean, Mike is here today because I grabbed that steering wheel and saved his life. Actually, one day I want to write a book, and I want to have chapter headings like, I am never going to share a room with Mike Zovath ever again. Mike, you don't just hear him snore, you experience it. You actually feel it.
Ken doesn't exaggerate anything, I'm sure, so.
It's like going to one of those theaters where the sound rumbles and the seats vibrate. It's like that. You're in a 4D theater. That's what it is. Anyway, Mike will remember because it was a historic day. It really was. This was a historic day in the life of this ministry. Because that night, Mike snored worse than he'd ever snored in his life. I mean, it was terrible.
And I'm tired, and I'm sure Ken was tired, but he couldn't get any sleep because I fell asleep right away. And there's some rumor that I snored a little bit. I must have made some noise.
It was so bad, the wallpaper came off the walls. The pillows were missing in the morning. I mean, he'd sucked them all up. And when we woke up in the morning, well, he woke up. I was awake all night.
And he was as mad as I've ever seen him. He was just He was so mad at me for something I don't even think I did. I have no recollection of it.
I looked at him and I said, Zovath, I am never, ever, 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 ever sharing a room with you ever, ever again. Go get me another room.
But he was furious for probably the next couple hours.
He didn't say one word. He just turned, went, organized another room. That was the end of that. We never shared a room ever again. So it was a historic moment in the life of this ministry.
But like I said, best night of my life, because from then on, he refused to share a room and I got my own. So it worked out really well.
You know, today we actually have some professional photographers at the Ministry of Answers in Genesis. I remember back in those days when, you know, all you could do, you had a camera. You know, I'd have to give the camera to Mike to take some photos. You know, I may as well have given it to a 6-month-old baby. You know, they're about as good as that. Probably not as good. Probably a 6-month-old baby could have done better anyway.
I keep thinking, well, how did we last so long?
One word, blackmail.
Now, a lot of that's because I'm so gentle and kind and I give in all the time and that sort of thing. And, you know, I put up with the antiques of Mike and Mark.
I've got things about both of them.
I mean, I'm the perfect one of the three, obviously.
One of them, if you could find the photo, it's of Ken back in Australia working at his desk. And he looks like the wild man from Borneo.
I mean, Mark is so annoying with all his puns. I mean, that's enough to drive anybody crazy.
And Ken, when he introduces me to people, if we have enough time, he'll say, Mark is the worst jokester, punster in the world.
But, you know, Mike and I put up with those.
And then I've got a photo of Mike. Why in the world he's dressed up in a full-length banana suit is beyond me. So in other words, I've got things I can use against them. So they have to keep me around because of, okay, blackmail.
You know, it is amazing that the three of us are still together as founders.
And now to be more serious, and we hear this time and time again from other ministries, they're shocked that 3 founders are still together.
Well, like I said, we've got different traits, different skill sets, I guess you'd say.
For each of us, we recognize it's the Lord's ministry, it's not ours. We don't have personal agendas.
Well, Ken's the visionary.
We weren't really competing with each other. I couldn't compete with Ken.
And he just has some gifts that can only be explained by God giving them.
He's probably the best teacher, speaker I've ever seen, and bar none. And Mark is probably the smoothest communicator I've ever met. I've never met somebody who can remember every conversation he ever had. The guy's a Rolodex, and for people who don't know what a Rolodex was, you have to look it up. But he's amazing. And so how do you compete with that?
And Mike, coming from a military background, and my background of being kind of a diplomat in my life and trying to smooth things out.
And I think it's also because we all have the same heart, and that is to see people impacted by God's word and the gospel. Totally different personalities. I mean, in many ways, they couldn't be more different. And yet, we get on with each other, we greatly respect each other, we love each other, and we want to honor each other because we recognize God called us to do this. That's why we do it, and He brought us together. Yeah, a school teacher, retired lieutenant colonel, and a history buff. Oh, that's how we did it.